England, autumn 1888. Rain fell steadily over the sprawling countryside, turning the roads into ribbons of mud beneath a gray sky. Blackthorn Castle stood proudly on a hill, its ancient towers disappearing into the mist. For centuries it had belonged to the Ashford family, one of England's oldest noble houses. Inside those stone walls lived Duke Edward Ashford, 32 years old, handsome, respected, one of the richest men in Britain. Yet despite everything he possessed, he lived alone. The grand dining hall echoed every evening with nothing but the sound of one chair being pulled from a table. Every servant knew their duke followed the same routine: breakfast alone, work alone, dinner alone, evening in the library, then bed. No laughter, no music, no guests, no Duchess. The newspapers loved writing about him. England's most eligible bachelor refuses every proposal. Every season, dozens of noble families tried introducing their daughters to him. Every season they failed. Edward never behaved rudely. He simply smiled politely and said no. No one understood why. That Thursday evening, Edward attended a charity gala held inside Westminster Hall. Crystal chandeliers illuminated the ballroom, while London's elite danced beneath golden ceilings. Ladies whispered as the Duke entered. He finally came. "I wonder which debutante he'll choose tonight. My daughter must dance with him." Edward ignored every curious glance. He disliked crowded rooms. He attended only because his late father had always supported the orphanage hosting the event. After making his donation, he quietly slipped away from ballroom. He preferred silence over music. Outside, rain had begun to fall. He stood beneath the stone balcony, overlooking the gardens. The cool air felt refreshing. For the first time that evening, he smiled. Then, he heard someone laughing. Not loudly, not carelessly. A soft, genuine laugh. It came from the rose garden below. Curious, Edward looked down. A young woman knelt beside a frightened little girl, whose umbrella had been blown away by the wind. Instead of calling servants, the woman simply removed her own cloak and wrapped it around the child. "It's only rain," she said warmly. "But catching a cold would be terribly inconvenient, wouldn't it?" The little girl giggled. Edward watched silently. The woman had no jewels, no expensive gown, no noble title, just a simple emerald green dress beneath her traveling cloak. Yet, she carried herself with quiet grace. Moments later, the child's parents arrived, thanking her repeatedly. She smiled. "It's nothing." Then she disappeared toward the carriage entrance. Edward didn't even know her name, but for reasons he couldn't explain, his eyes followed her until she vanished into the rain. The next morning, Edward couldn't stop thinking about her. It irritated him. He barely remembered the faces of London's aristocracy, yet he remembered hers perfectly. Those calm hazel eyes, that quiet smile, the kindness she had shown without expecting recognition. Who was she? Later that afternoon, his elderly butler entered the study. "Your Grace, a visitor wishes to see you." Edward frowned. "I have no appointments." "She insists it concerns your late father." That made Edward pause. "My father?" "Yes, Your Grace." "Show her in." A few moments later, the same young woman from the garden entered the study. Edward recognized her immediately. She seemed just as surprised to see him. For a brief second, neither spoke. Finally, she bowed respectfully. "My name is Clara Bennet, Your Grace." Edward gestured toward a chair. "You said this concerns my father." "Yes." She carefully placed an old leather parcel on the desk. The leather looked weathered by time. The wax seal had faded. "I've been searching for you for 6 months." Edward's expression hardened. "What is this?" Clara took a slow breath. "My grandfather worked as your father's personal solicitor when he passed away last month. We found something hidden inside his safe." Edward slowly untied the leather cord. Inside lay a single envelope, yellow with age. Its wax seal bore the Ashford family crest. Edward's heartbeat slowed. He knew that seal. His father had used it. But his father had died 20 years ago. He looked toward Clara. "Where did this come from?" "My grandfather was instructed to deliver it." Only after your 32nd birthday. Edward stared at her in disbelief. My father prepared this 20 years ago. She nodded. He believed one day. You would need the truth. Silence filled the room. Edward carefully broke the brittle wax seal. Inside was a single folded sheet. The handwriting was unmistakable. It belonged to Duke William Ashford, his father. Edward's hands trembled as he read the first line. My dear Edward, if you are reading this, then everything you believe about your past is a lie. The color drained from his face. He looked up at Clara. What does this mean? She shook her head. I don't know. My grandfather never told me. He only made me promise that this letter would reach you. Edward looked back down. His eyes continued reading. Then suddenly, he froze. His breathing stopped. The final line on the page read, The woman carrying this letter is the only person you can trust. Edward slowly lifted his eyes toward Clara. She looked just as shocked as he was, because she had never read the letter either. For several long seconds, neither Edward nor Clara spoke. The only sound inside the study was the crackling fire. Edward looked at the final sentence again. The woman carrying this letter is the only person you can trust. His father had written those words 20 years ago. 20 years before he could possibly know Clara Bennett. It was impossible. Edward slowly folded the letter. Miss Bennett. His voice was calm, but his gray eyes were filled with questions. Have we ever met before today? Clara shook her head. No, Your Grace. I've never been to Blackthorn Castle. And I've certainly never met your father. Edward studied her face carefully. She wasn't lying. At least, he didn't think she was. Sit down. Clara hesitated before taking the chair opposite him. Edward walked toward the window. Rain continued falling over the castle gardens. My father died when I was 12. He never mentioned your family. Clara nodded quietly. My grandfather never spoke of yours either. He only said, she paused, that one day England's future would depend on a letter. Edward almost laughed. It sounded like a fairy tale. I thought the same. But then, she looked toward the envelope. I found this. Edward unfolded the letter again. This time he continued reading. My dear Edward, if you are reading this, then I have already failed to protect you. Do not believe everything you have been told about our family, especially not the story of your mother's death. Edward stopped reading. His breathing became shallow. His mother, everyone had always said she died from illness. He had believed it his entire life. Why would his father write this? He continued. Someone very close to this family betrayed us. I cannot write that person's name. This letter may not remain hidden forever. Walls have ears. Servants have masters. Friends sometimes become enemies. Edward frowned. His father had never spoken like this. The handwriting itself looked rushed, uneven, as though it had been written in fear. The final paragraph read, Trust no one until you discover what is hidden beneath Blackthorn Castle. Nothing more. No explanation. No names. No clues. Only questions. Edward placed the letter on the desk. So, my father believed someone inside this family betrayed him. Clara nodded slowly. It appears so. And he trusted your grandfather. Enough to leave him this letter. She answered quietly. They were close friends. My grandfather always refused to explain why. Edward suddenly noticed something strange. The envelope felt heavier than the paper inside. He examined it carefully, then turned it upside down. A tiny metallic sound echoed. Clink. Something was hidden inside the envelope itself. Using a small letter opener, he carefully separated the inner lining. A tiny brass key slid onto the desk. Both stared at it. It was old, very old. Around its handle, someone had engraved a single word. Aurora. What does that mean? Edward whispered. Clara shook her head. I've never heard that name. Edward turned the key over. No numbers. No crest. Just Aurora. At that exact moment, someone knocked on the study door. The elderly butler entered. Forgive the interruption, Your Grace. A gentleman has arrived unexpectedly. Edward frowned. Who? Lord Sebastian Hawthorne. Edward sighed. Sebastian, his closest friend, they had grown up together. Their estates bordered one another. Since his father's death, Sebastian had become almost like a brother. Edward glanced toward the letter, then remembered his father's warning. Trust no one. For the first time in years, Edward hesitated before saying, "Show him to the drawing room." "I'm coming." A few minutes later, Edward entered the drawing room alone. Sebastian smiled warmly. "My dear Edward, you become impossible to visit." The two men shook hands. Sebastian laughed. "You look troubled. Too much paperwork?" Edward forced a smile. "Something like that." Sebastian poured himself tea without asking. His behavior was comfortable, natural, exactly like family. Yet, Edward couldn't stop hearing his father's words. Someone very close to this family betrayed us. Meanwhile, Clara remained inside the study. She carefully returned the letter to its envelope. As she did, something caught her eye. One corner of the parchment reflected light differently. She carried it closer to the fireplace. Slowly, a hidden sentence appeared between the faded ink, written with invisible ink. She gasped. It read, "If Edward is not alone, burn this letter immediately." Before she could think, the study door creaked open. She quickly looked up. A shadow stood in the doorway. Not Edward, not the butler, just a tall figure dressed completely in black, his face hidden beneath a hat. He spoke only one sentence. "You should never have brought that letter to Blackthorn Castle." Then he stepped inside and quietly locked the door behind him. The stranger quietly locked the study door. The metallic click echoed through the room. Clara instinctively stepped backward. The folded letter remained hidden inside her sleeve. The mysterious man removed his gloves with unsettling calm. His face was partly hidden beneath the brim of a black hat. Only his piercing blue eyes could be seen. Cold, emotionless. "You should not have come here," he said. Clara gathered her courage. "Who are you?" Instead of answering, the man glanced toward the fireplace, then toward the envelope on the desk. "I'll ask only once. Give me the letter." Clara's heart pounded. She realized one terrifying truth. Whoever this man was, he already knew about the letter. He even knew where it had been delivered. Someone had been watching her for days, perhaps even weeks. She forced herself to remain calm. "I don't know what you're talking about." The stranger smiled faintly. "A brave lie, but still a lie." He slowly stepped closer. "I have no wish to hurt you. I only want what belongs to me." At that exact moment, a loud voice echoed from the hallway. "Miss Bennet." It was Edward. The stranger's expression changed instantly. Without another word, he rushed toward the tall study window. Before Clara could react, he smashed the glass with his elbow. Cold wind exploded into the room. The stranger jumped from the second-floor window, disappearing into the heavy rain. Edward burst inside seconds later. "Clara." He stopped at the broken window. "What happened?" She struggled to catch her breath. "There was a man. He wanted the letter." Edward immediately looked toward the desk. The envelope was still there, untouched. The stranger hadn't had enough time. Within minutes, castle guards searched every corner of Blackthorn. The stables, the gardens, the woods, the servant quarters. Nothing. The mysterious visitor had vanished without leaving a single trace, almost as if he had known every secret passage inside the estate. That evening, Edward stood inside the library. The brass key rested on the table before him. Beside it lay the letter. Clara sat opposite him. Neither had spoken for several minutes. Finally, Edward broke the silence. "My father wrote, 'Trust no one until you discover what is hidden beneath Blackthorn Castle.'" He looked at the key. "And now someone is willing to kill for this letter." Clara quietly asked, "You think the key opens whatever your father wanted you to find?" Edward nodded slowly. "I believe so. But where?" The answer came unexpectedly. The elderly butler entered carrying a tray of tea. As he placed it on the table, his eyes briefly fell upon the brass key. His face turned pale. Only for a second, but Clara noticed. Edward noticed too. "You recognize this key." The butler immediately looked away. I'm afraid not, Your Grace. Edward stepped closer. You hesitated. No. I merely thought it looked old. Edward's voice became firmer. Thomas, you've served this family for 43 years. You carried me in your arms when I was a child. If you know something, tell me. The old butler lowered his eyes. His hands trembled. I promise your father. I would never speak. Silence filled the library. Edward had never seen the old man afraid. Not once. Until now. Finally, Thomas whispered, There is a room beneath this castle. Edward frowned. A cellar? The butler slowly shook his head. No, a chamber older than Blackthorn itself. My father once called it the room that must never be opened. Clara leaned forward. How do we reach it? Thomas hesitated. I don't know. I only know the entrance disappeared many years ago. Your father sealed it himself. Edward picked up the brass key again. Aurora, what does that mean? Thomas's eyes widened. You said, Aurora? Edward nodded. The old butler slowly sat down. His face had lost all color. I haven't heard that word. Since your mother died. Edward froze. My mother? Thomas swallowed hard. There used to be a music room. Your mother loved playing the piano there. The room's name was Aurora. Edward stared at the key. The music room still exists. Thomas slowly shook his head. It shouldn't. It was demolished 20 years ago. Clara suddenly stood. No, it wasn't. Both men looked at her. She spoke quietly. When I arrived yesterday, I noticed something strange. There are windows on the east side of the castle, but from inside, that hallway doesn't exist. Edward frowned. What do you mean? The outside of Blackthorn has one extra row of windows, but inside, there are no rooms behind them. Thomas looked horrified. My God! He whispered. It wasn't demolished. It was hidden. None of them slept that night. Just before midnight, Edward, Clara, and Thomas carried lanterns through the silent corridors of Blackthorn Castle. The servants believed the Duke had retired. No one saw them disappear into the abandoned East Wing. Dust covered every inch of the corridor. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling. It looked untouched for decades. Finally, they reached a massive wall covered with faded wallpaper. Clara slowly raised her lantern. Look. Edward stepped closer. The wallpaper wasn't attached properly. Behind it was the outline of an enormous wooden door, hidden inside the wall. His heartbeat quickened. He pulled away the rotten wallpaper. A magnificent oak door appeared beneath it, untouched by time. There was no handle, no keyhole visible, only a carved golden sun. And beneath it, one single word. Aurora. Edward slowly removed the brass key from his pocket. Its shape matched the symbol perfectly. He looked at Clara. She nodded silently. Taking a deep breath, Edward inserted the key. The lock clicked. Then, from somewhere deep beneath the castle, a loud mechanical rumble echoed through the walls. Dust fell from the ceiling. The hidden door slowly began to open by itself. A freezing wind rushed out from the darkness. And far below, someone's footsteps echoed. They were not alone. The hidden door groaned as it slowly opened. A blast of icy air escaped from the darkness below. Edward raised his lantern. A narrow stone staircase disappeared deep beneath Blackthorn Castle. The walls were covered with dust. No one had entered this place in decades. Thomas crossed himself. I prayed this room had died with your father. Edward looked at him, but it didn't. Without another word, he stepped onto the first stair. Clara followed. Thomas hesitated, then reluctantly came behind them. The staircase seemed endless. Every footstep echoed through the underground passage. After nearly 2 minutes, they reached a massive circular chamber. Clara's eyes widened. It wasn't a cellar. It looked like a forgotten chapel. Ancient stone columns surrounded the room. Hundreds of candles, long melted away, still stood upon iron holders. In the center, a marble table rested beneath a magnificent glass ceiling through which moonlight quietly entered. Edward slowly walked forward. Everything had been left exactly as it was 20 years ago, almost as if someone had intended to return. Then Clara noticed something. Edward, she pointed toward the far wall. There hung a large family portrait. Edward smiled faintly. My parents. But as he came closer, the smile disappeared. The painting wasn't of three people. It was of four. His father, his mother, young Edward, and a little girl, perhaps 5 years old. She stood beside Edward, holding his hand. Edward stared at the painting. I've never seen her before. Thomas looked horrified. That's impossible. I attended every portrait session. There were only 3. Clara stepped closer. No, there were 4. Someone had deliberately hidden this painting beneath the castle. Edward noticed a brass plaque beneath it, covered in dust. He wiped it clean. The inscription read, "The Ashford Family, Spring 1868." And below, smaller letters, Edward and Eleanor. Edward frowned. Eleanor? He whispered. Who's Eleanor? Thomas looked completely confused. I don't know, but Your Grace. I swear she was never spoken of. Clara slowly looked around the chamber. This room wasn't hidden because of the portrait. It was hidden because of whatever this girl represents. Edward nodded. My father wanted someone to forget she ever existed. Suddenly, a faint metallic sound echoed. Click. All 3 turned. The chamber door had quietly closed behind them. Thomas rushed toward it. It won't open. Edward grabbed the handle. It refused to move. The mechanism had locked itself. Clara raised her lantern. There must be another exit. They began searching the chamber. Bookshelves, cabinets, old trunks. Everything was covered with thick dust. Then Clara found something. A beautifully carved wooden music box. It sat alone upon a marble shelf. Untouched, she gently opened it. A delicate melody filled the chamber. Soft, beautiful, heartbreaking. Edward suddenly froze. His breathing became uneven. The music, it felt familiar, very familiar. Images flashed inside his mind. A little girl laughing, running through a garden, holding white roses. A woman's voice calling. Edward. Another child's voice answered. I'm coming. Edward grabbed his head. The memories vanished. Clara rushed toward him. Edward. I'm all right. He wasn't. His hands were shaking. I know that song. I've heard it before. But where? Then the music stopped by itself. Inside the music box, a hidden compartment quietly opened. There was another letter, smaller than the first. This one was addressed differently. It read, For Edward, when you finally find Aurora. Edward carefully unfolded it. His father's handwriting again. My son, if you have reached this chamber, then Clara Bennett must be with you. Edward immediately looked at Clara. She looked equally shocked. His father had written her full name 20 years before she was born. He continued reading. There is something you must understand before it is too late. You were never meant to marry for power. You were never meant to inherit Blackthorn alone. The future of our family was decided long before either of you were born. Edward's heartbeat quickened. What? He whispered. Does that mean? The next sentence left both of them speechless. Your marriage to Clara Bennett was promised before your birth. Silence. No one moved. Edward slowly raised his eyes. Clara's face had turned pale. She whispered, That can't be true. I've never even heard your family's name before last week. Edward looked back at the letter. His father continued, If fate has brought the two of you together, then destiny has already begun correcting the greatest mistake our family ever made. Thomas suddenly staggered backward. His face was white. My God! I remember now. Edward turned. What do you remember? Thomas looked at Clara with trembling eyes. I've seen you before. Clara frowned. That's impossible. No. The old butler whispered. I held you in my arms. The night Blackthorn Castle caught fire. The room fell silent. Clara stared at him in disbelief. I've never been here. Thomas slowly shook his head. Yes. You were. You just don't remember. At that exact moment, a loud explosion echoed somewhere above the chamber. The entire castle shook violently. Dust rained from the ceiling. Then came the sound of frantic bells. Blackthorn Castle was on fire. The castle bells rang wildly. Dong, dong, dong. Smoke rushed through the underground staircase. Thomas looked toward the ceiling in horror. The east wing. It's burning. Edward immediately folded the letter and slipped it inside his coat. We have to get out. The hidden chamber shook violently. Pieces of stone began falling from the ceiling. Clara held her lantern tightly. The entrance is locked. Edward rushed toward the massive oak door. He pulled the iron handle with all his strength. Nothing. The mechanism refused to move. Thomas searched the walls desperately. There must be another exit. Edward remembered something. His father had once written, "Every prison has two doors. The second is found only by those who stop looking at the first." His eyes quickly scanned the chamber. Then he noticed the family portrait again. It wasn't hanging perfectly straight. "Help me." Together, Edward and Thomas pulled the enormous painting away from the wall. Behind it, a narrow stone passage appeared. Cold air flowed through it. Clara smiled with relief. Another tunnel. Without hesitation, the three hurried inside. The passage twisted beneath the castle. Smoke followed them. The air grew hotter with every step. Finally, a wooden hatch appeared above them. Edward pushed it open. Fresh night air rushed inside. They emerged into the castle gardens. The sight before them was terrifying. The entire east wing was engulfed in flames. Servants ran in every direction. Buckets of water passed from hand to hand. Horses screamed inside the stables. Glass shattered. Black smoke covered the moon. Edward immediately took command. Everyone away from the east wing. Save the servants first. Forget the furniture. Human lives come before the house. The frightened staff instantly obeyed. For the first time, Clara saw why people respected him so deeply. Even surrounded by disaster, he remained calm. Then a young maid came running. "Catherine is still inside." Edward's face changed. "What?" "The laundry maid." She was cleaning the nursery. Without thinking, Edward ran toward the burning building. "Edward!" Clara shouted, but he was already inside. Smoke filled every corridor. The wooden ceiling creaked dangerously. Edward covered his mouth with his coat. "Catherine!" No answer, only flames. Then, a faint cry. "Your Grace." Edward followed the voice. A collapsed beam blocked the hallway. Beyond it, a terrified young maid lay trapped beneath broken furniture. Edward ignored the fire. He lifted the burning beam with both hands. His sleeves caught fire. Still, he refused to let go. "Crawl." The frightened girl squeezed beneath the beam. Edward pushed her toward the doorway. "Run." She escaped, just as the ceiling collapsed behind him. Outside, Clara's heart nearly stopped. The entrance disappeared beneath falling stone. "No." She whispered, "No." Several servants tried pulling her away. She refused. Tears filled her eyes. "He can't still be inside." Then, through the smoke, a familiar figure emerged. Edward stumbled out of the flames. His coat was burned. His forehead bled slightly, but he was alive. The entire courtyard erupted in relief. Before Edward could speak, Clara ran toward him. Without caring who was watching, she threw her arms around him. For several seconds, neither moved. Edward slowly wrapped his arms around her. His heartbeat pounded against hers. It was the first time either of them had allowed their feelings to show. The servants quietly looked away. Even Thomas smiled. Clara finally realized what she had done. She stepped back immediately. I'm sorry." Edward looked at her. For the first time since they'd met, his eyes softened completely. "You thought I'd die." She lowered her gaze. "I did." Silence. Then Edward smiled. A real smile. Warm. Gentle. "You were crying." "I don't cry." "You were?" "I wasn't." "You still are." She laughed through her tears. "You are impossible." That single laugh changed everything. For the first time in years, Blackthorn Castle heard genuine happiness, even while smoke still rose into the night sky. Later, the fire was finally extinguished. Only part of the east wing had been destroyed. The hidden chamber remained untouched beneath the ground. Edward, Clara, and Thomas returned to the library. The second letter lay on the table. Edward unfolded it again. There must be more. Clara looked carefully at the edges. The paper is unusually thick. Edward examined it against the firelight. Another hidden message slowly appeared, written in invisible ink. Only 5 words. Find the silver rose before Christmas. Thomas frowned. The silver rose? Edward looked up. Do you know what it is? The old butler slowly nodded. I thought it was only a legend. My father once told me that every Duke of Blackthorn protected something called a silver rose. What is it? Thomas swallowed. No one knows. But according to the old stories, it proves who the rightful Duke truly is. Silence filled the room. If that legend was true, everything Edward believed about his family could soon be destroyed. Just then, a servant hurried into the library. Your Grace, a gentleman insists on seeing you immediately. Edward frowned. Who? The servant answered nervously. He says, his name is Lord Richard Ashford. Edward's expression changed. There is no Lord Richard Ashford. The servant looked terrified. He says, he is your elder brother. The room fell completely silent. Thomas dropped the tea tray. Clara's face turned pale. Edward whispered, my brother died 20 years ago. At that exact moment, the library doors slowly opened. A tall man stepped inside. His face was almost identical to Edward's. He smiled faintly, then said the words that changed everything. Good evening, little brother. For a long moment, no one moved. The fire crackled softly inside the library. Edward stared at the stranger standing in the doorway. It was like looking into an older version of himself. The same dark hair, the same gray eyes, the same sharp jawline. Only one difference. This man's face carried years of hardship. A thin scar across his left cheek. His expensive coat was worn from long journeys, but his smile was calm, almost sad. Thomas whispered, It can't be. The tray slipped from his trembling hands. Porcelain shattered across the floor. The stranger looked at the old butler. It's good to see you again, Thomas. You've grown older. Thomas's knees almost gave way. My Lord Richard, I buried you. The man smiled faintly. So everyone believes. Edward slowly stepped forward. My brother died. I attended his funeral. The stranger looked directly into his eyes. No, you attended an empty coffin. Silence filled the room. Edward's voice hardened. Who are you? The man reached inside his coat. Every guard instantly drew his sword. Edward raised one hand. No, let him speak. The stranger carefully removed a small silver pocket watch. He placed it on the library table. Edward's heart skipped. He knew that watch. His father had owned it. Inside the lid, 2 small initials were engraved. W.A., William Ashford, their father's initials. My father gave this to Richard. Edward whispered. The stranger nodded. On my 10th birthday. Edward picked up the watch. His hands trembled. There was no possible way anyone else could have owned it. Clara quietly observed everything. Something felt strange. The man's eyes were kind, but every answer he gave seemed carefully prepared. Almost too perfect. Edward looked at him again. If you're truly Richard, tell me something only my brother would know. The stranger smiled. You were 6 years old. You climbed onto the roof to rescue a white dove. You became trapped. You cried for 2 hours. Father punished me instead, because I was supposed to be watching you. Edward froze. No one knew that story. No one, not even Thomas. Slowly, Edward lowered his guard. It really is you. For the first time in 20 years, the brothers embraced. The servants quietly wiped tears from their eyes. Thomas openly wept. Even Clara smiled, at least until she noticed something. Richard never hugged Edward tightly. His eyes remained open, watching everyone else, measuring them. It lasted only a second, but Clara noticed. Later that evening, the brothers sat alone inside the study. Rain once again fell against the windows. Edward poured 2 glasses of whiskey. Where have you been all these years? Richard stared into the fire. A very long story. I was kidnapped. My carriage was attacked. I escaped, but I couldn't return. Why? They would have killed me. Edward frowned. Who? Richard looked at him. The same people who murdered our mother. The room became silent. Edward remembered the first letter. Do not believe the story of your mother's death. His father hadn't lied. Richard continued. Our mother wasn't ill. She was poisoned. Edward slowly stood. No, that's impossible. It's the truth. Our father discovered it. And before he could expose a murderer, he died. Edward whispered. Who did it? Richard shook his head. I don't know. But someone inside Blackthorn wanted this family destroyed. Outside the study, Clara accidentally overheard part of the conversation. Something still felt wrong. Very wrong. If Richard had been kidnapped as a child, how had he survived for 20 years? Why hadn't he contacted anyone? Why appear now, exactly when the letters resurfaced? Unable to sleep, Clara returned to the underground chamber alone. She carried only a lantern, the music box, and the second letter. The castle above had become silent. Every servant believed she was asleep. She carefully examined every inch of the chamber again. Nothing, until her lantern illuminated something hidden beneath the marble table. A tiny carving, almost invisible. She knelt, brushed away decades of dust. The inscription read, Truth can only be seen in moonlight. She frowned. Moonlight. She slowly extinguished her lantern. The chamber became dark. Only pale moonlight entered through the glass ceiling above. Then, the marble floor began glowing faintly. Silver lines appeared across the stone, forming a map. Clara stared in amazement. The glowing lines led toward one corner of the chamber. She followed them. There, hidden beneath loose stones, she discovered a small iron chest. The brass key labeled Aurora fit perfectly. The lock clicked. Inside the chest lay dozens of old documents, birth records, estate papers, family journals, and one sealed envelope. Across the front, Edward's father had written, Open only if Richard ever returns. Clara's heartbeat quickened. She slowly opened it. Inside, there was only one sentence. She read it once. Then again, her face lost all color. She whispered, No, this can't be, because the letter read, If the man calling himself Richard Ashford returns to Blackthorn, do not believe him. My eldest son died on the night of the fire. At that exact moment, a slow clap echoed through the chamber. Clara spun around. Someone stood in the darkness, watching her. It wasn't Edward, and it wasn't Richard. The mysterious man in the black coat stepped into the moonlight. His blue eyes gleamed coldly. He smiled, then quietly said, You've discovered the truth far sooner than I expected, Miss Bennet. The slow clap echoed through the hidden chamber. Clap, clap, clap. Clara tightened her grip on the lantern. The mysterious man in the black coat stepped into the pale moonlight. For the first time, she could see his face clearly. He looked to be in his early 40s. His sharp blue eyes never left hers. A faint scar across his cheek. His expression carried neither anger nor fear, only confidence, almost as if he had expected this moment for years. You've discovered the truth much sooner than I expected, Miss Bennet. Clara took a cautious step backward. Who are you? The man smiled. My name doesn't matter. What matters is whether you leave this room alive. His eyes shifted toward the open chest. You've read the letter. Clara silently slipped the letter into her coat. The stranger chuckled. Wise, but not wise enough. Without warning, 2 armed men emerged from the darkness behind him. Their faces were hidden beneath black masks. They slowly surrounded Clara. There is nowhere to run, the stranger said calmly. Give me the documents, Clara shook her head. Never. The stranger sighed. I was hoping you'd make this easier. One of the masked men lunged toward her. At that exact moment, bang! A gunshot echoed through the chamber. The bullet struck the stone wall inches from Clara. Everyone turned. Edward stood at the entrance of the chamber, a smoking revolver in his hand. Behind him, Thomas and 3 castle guards rushed inside. Edward's voice thundered through the chamber. Step away from her. Relief flooded Clara's face. Edward. The stranger smiled. So, the Duke finally arrives. Edward walked directly toward Clara, without taking his eyes off the man. Are you hurt? She shook her head. No. He gently took her hand. Only after making sure she was safe did he face the stranger. Who are you? The man removed his gloves. My name is... Victor Blackwood. Thomas gasped. No. You died 30 years ago. Victor laughed softly. That's what everyone was supposed to believe. Edward frowned. You know him? Thomas nodded with trembling lips. Victor Blackwood was your father's closest friend. The chamber fell silent. Edward stared at Victor in disbelief. My father's friend? Victor smiled bitterly. Friend, for many years, until William betrayed me. Edward's voice became colder. My father betrayed no one. Victor's smile disappeared. He stole everything from me. My title, my future, and the woman I loved. Clara frowned. The woman you loved? Victor slowly looked toward the hidden portrait of Edward's family. His eyes stopped on the Duchess. Your mother? Edward froze. Victor continued. I loved Elizabeth before William ever met her. She chose him. I accepted it. But your father didn't trust me. He believed I wanted revenge. Edward shouted, because you did. Victor nodded calmly. Eventually, yes. Thomas whispered, my God. Victor slowly walked around the chamber. You spent your entire life believing your mother died of illness. She didn't. Edward's fist tightened. Victor continued without emotion. She died protecting her children. Edward's breathing became heavy. What children? Victor slowly pointed toward the hidden portrait. The answer has been hanging on that wall for 20 years. Everyone turned toward the painting. Victor spoke quietly. The little girl, Eleanor, was your twin sister. Silence. Complete silence. Edward stared at the portrait. A twin sister? Impossible. His entire childhood. Everyone had told him he was an only child. Victor nodded. Your father erased her existence. He believed hiding her was the only way to save her. Clara whispered. Save her from whom? Victor smiled. From me. Edward looked at Victor with hatred. You murdered my sister. Victor shook his head. No, I never found her. Edward blinked. What? Victor stepped closer. Your sister escaped. And for 20 years... I've searched every corner of England. His eyes slowly turned toward Clara. Edward immediately stepped in front of her. Victor laughed. You still don't understand. Edward's heartbeat quickened. What are you talking about? Victor looked directly at Clara, then spoke the words that changed everything. Clara Bennett isn't Clara Bennett. Thomas looked stunned. Victor continued. The night Blackthorn burned, your father secretly gave Eleanor to his solicitor. He changed her name. He erased every record. He raised her as his own granddaughter. Edward slowly turned toward Clara. She was trembling. Victor smiled. So, tell me, should I call you Miss Bennett? Or Lady Eleanor Ashford? Clara's eyes filled with tears. Fragments of childhood memories flashed through her mind. A grand staircase. A woman singing. A little boy holding her hand, a white rose garden, then darkness. She whispered, I remember. Edward stared at her in disbelief. You, my sister? Clara slowly shook her head, tears streaming down her face. No, I can't be. I love you. The words escaped before she could stop them. The entire chamber fell silent. Edward's heart shattered. For days, He had fallen in love with Clara, and now the woman he loved might be his own sister. Neither of them noticed Victor smiling in the shadows, because that was exactly the lie he wanted them to believe. The underground chamber fell into complete silence. Clara's tear-filled eyes remained fixed on Edward. I love you. Edward felt as if the world had collapsed beneath his feet. His heart refused to believe what his mind had just heard. His father had promised their marriage. Victor claimed Clara was his twin sister. Both couldn't be true. One of them was lying. And Edward suddenly realized only one man in the room wanted them to stop trusting each other. Victor. Edward slowly stepped in front of Clara. No. Victor smiled. You still refuse to accept the truth. Edward looked directly into his eyes. My father planned my marriage to Clara before either of us was born. He would never promise his own son to his daughter. Victor's smile faded for the first time. Edward continued. So either my father was insane, or you're lying. Victor remained silent. Clara looked at Edward. Hope slowly returned to her eyes. Edward turned toward Thomas. Thomas, you were here the night of the fire. Thomas nodded. You carried Clara as a baby. You remember something. The old butler closed his eyes. For years, he had buried the memories. Now, they returned. It wasn't one child. Thomas whispered. There were 2 little girls. Everyone looked at him. Thomas continued. The Duchess gave birth to twins. A boy and a girl. Edward and Eleanor. Edward's face turned pale. So Victor was telling the truth? Thomas shook his head. Not completely. There was another baby that night. Clara frowned. Another baby? Thomas nodded. Your grandfather, Arthur Bennett. His daughter died giving birth the very same night. There were 2 newborn girls inside Blackthorn Castle. Victor's expression suddenly hardened. Thomas continued. The fire started. Everyone panicked. To protect the Ashford bloodline, William secretly sent Eleanor away. But Thomas looked at Clara. Arthur Bennett also lost his granddaughter. There were 2 babies. Edward's heartbeat quickened. So, which child is Clara? Thomas slowly lowered his head. I don't know. The babies were wrapped in identical blankets. Only William knew. And he died before telling anyone. Silence. Victor suddenly laughed. A cold, cruel laugh. You finally understood. Edward looked at him. You never knew either. Victor smiled. No. I searched for Eleanor for 20 years. When Clara appeared, I wasn't certain. So I gave you a story. I wanted both of you to destroy yourselves. If you believed you were brother and sister, you'd never stand together. Clara gasped. It was all a lie? Victor shrugged. Perhaps. Perhaps not. Edward's anger exploded. You monster. Victor quickly pulled out a revolver. The guards raised their weapons. Victor aimed directly at Edward. If I can at Blackthorn, no one will. Bang! The shot echoed through the chamber. Clara screamed. Edward felt someone push him aside. Thomas, the loyal old butler, had thrown himself in front of the Duke. The bullet struck his chest. He collapsed into Edward's arms. Thomas! Edward shouted. Thomas smiled weakly. I promise. Your father, I protect you until my last breath. His hand slowly slipped away. The faithful servant who had protected the Ashford family for 43 years was gone. Victor turned to run. But before he could reach the tunnel, Edward tackled him to the ground. The 2 men struggled across the stone floor. Victor grabbed a knife. Edward caught his wrist. The blade slipped from Victor's hand. With one final punch, Edward knocked him unconscious. The guards immediately chained him. The nightmare was finally over. 3 weeks later, Blackthorn Castle had begun to heal. Thomas was buried beneath the old oak tree overlooking the gardens he had loved for decades. Every servant attended. Edward placed a single white rose upon his grave. You were more than a servant. You were family. Victor Blackwood confessed everything during his trial. Years ago, He had discovered William Ashford's secret letters, believing Eleanor held the key to Blackthorn's inheritance. He spent 20 years searching for her. When Clara appeared with a letter, he assumed she had to be Eleanor. Unable to prove it, he chose to manipulate everyone instead. The poisoning, the fire, the forged stories, the attacks, the black-cloaked stranger. It had all been Victor. He was sentenced to spend the rest of his life in prison. But one mystery still remained. Who was Clara? Edward refused to leave the question unanswered. Together with the royal archives, church records, and Arthur Bennett's old journals, weeks of searching finally uncovered the truth. Hidden inside an old parish register was the final piece. The midwife had secretly corrected the record one day after the fire. It revealed that Clara Bennett was not Eleanor Ashford. She was Arthur Bennett's biological granddaughter. The real Eleanor Ashford had survived the fire, but William had secretly sent her to France under another identity to protect her from Victor. She had lived there peacefully, married, and passed away years earlier from illness, leaving no children. Edward's twin sister had been safe all along. Edward closed the old register. A deep breath escaped his lips. He looked toward Clara. A smile slowly appeared. We're not brother and sister. Clara burst into tears. This time, they were tears of relief. Edward walked toward her. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he gently took her hands. The first day I saw you, you were standing in the rain helping a frightened little girl. I thought I had never seen anyone so beautiful. Clara smiled through her tears. I fell in love with you the moment you thanked me instead of ordering me. Edward laughed softly. So, my father was right. She tilted her head. About what? He smiled. That I could trust only one person. Edward slowly knelt before her. From his pocket, he removed a small velvet box. Inside was a beautiful silver ring shaped like a rose. The silver rose, Clara whispered. Edward nodded. It wasn't a treasure. It wasn't a crown. It was a symbol of choosing love over power. He looked into her eyes. Clara Bennett, will you become the Duchess of Blackthorn? Tears streamed down her face. She laughed, then nodded. Yes, always. The servants erupted in applause. Church bells rang across the valley. Sunlight poured through the castle windows. For the first time in 20 years, Blackthorn Castle no longer felt haunted. Its secrets had finally been buried. Its wounds had finally healed. And where fear had once ruled, love had finally found its home. 1 year later, the library of Blackthorn Castle had become the largest public library in the county. Children filled its halls with laughter. Clara personally welcomed every visitor. Edward often smiled as he watched her from across the room. One rainy afternoon, a little girl asked Clara, Your Grace, do castles always keep secrets? Clara smiled gently and looked toward Edward. Yes, they do. But the greatest secret of all is that even the darkest castle can become a home when it's filled with love. Edward took her hand. Together, they walked through the grand halls of Blackthorn Castle, leaving the shadows behind forever. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.